my pleasure to talk to you today about perhaps one of the most important documents that the government has issued on higher education for some time. But before we discuss that, I just need to mention the atrocities that are happening in Ukraine and wish and hope that compassion will be shown there very, very soon. What we've received from the government in the last week have been their responses to the Augar report on funding higher education. This is a very important issue and one that we need to consider in the round of all the other recommendations and policies that have emerged in the last year or so. It is important because it shapes the way in which higher education is perceived in government and the way in which our students will understand the opportunities that it presents. In this extent that we need to look at this report, which by the way also includes recommendations on minimum entry standards, lowering fees on foundation years, talking about the lifelong education funding award, and other such things as sponsorship of students and the increase in capital funding. But first of all, let's just look at what this report does. It emerges into an environment where we've recently received recommendations on TEF, which talks about, as we've seen, excellence without any really substance on it, and then argues that if programs are not excellent, then indeed they can have their numbers reduced, or indeed the programs ought to be removed. This theme also appears in the most recent Augar reports responses. We've also seen that the government have tried to introduce legislation on post-qualification enrolment into universities. It has dabbled with the nature of free speech, and it has looked at the ways in which vocational education can be changed with a really relatively poor justification for that. It's also under the current Minister for Higher and Further Education suggested there should be changes in the way universities promote themselves in their advertising and indeed interfered with other aspects with which universities' autonomy can well be judged. If you interfere with the way in which funding occurs, you interfere with the ways in which programs universities can run, and you interfere with the ways in which students can enroll, it seems to me that's a full-out attack on university autonomy. So before we talk about that, let's just turn to what the response to Augar says. Well, it says perhaps in the positive side for the next couple of years that the fees that students will pay will not go down by the dramatic amount to say 7,500, which the industry were concerned about. Yet, of course, this is now, I think, the fifth year when we add those two in, where the fees have not increased. So giving a net reduction in fee income to the universities. There are also changes at which level repayment, this has been reduced to £25,000, and also positively, or so it seems, positively reducing the interest rate on the loans that are taken out. However, a deeper analysis, and indeed following the equality assessment that the government itself has made, these changes favour the rich and penalise the poor and give relatively little change to the Treasury. So there's a whole raft of proposals which affect repayment levels, particularly for the lower and middle ranking in professions, in professional incomes. These have been seen the interest payments increased and extended to up to 40 years before they will be written off. We've seen that the government is now going into consultation on minimum entry requirements. That is, they suggest that at least English and maths at GCSE level, or at least 2 A levels grade E, not to get into university, of course, but to qualify for the loan that is associated with paying fees. Now, this hypocritical way of trying to control entry into universities needs to be called out for what it is. And indeed, there's very little evidence which shows that if you enter university just with level 2 qualifications, that at the end of your career as an undergraduate, there is a less proportionate number of students who gain a 2-1. In fact, those with 3 A levels at A or A star tend to get exactly the same percentage of 2-1s as those who entered without A level qualifications at all. So there's a real issue about the judgment that's made about whether higher education can facilitate individuals' growth. And this isn't dependent on prior qualifications. The report also talks about reducing the cost of foundation years to make them more accessible, and the reduction in costs they're suggesting there on current prices is down by 40%. So what incentive there is to undertake that, I don't know. There are also other issues regarding to the lifelong learning account, which indeed is being advocated as the way forward for all funding of higher education, not simply for small modules. That necessarily requires that the university has to reshape all of its programs in terms of modules. There's no mention about how that can be done or how that can be funded. So there are significant elements in this report, which I would argue directly impacts the viability of universities. It also is important that we recognize that under the Skills Agenda and the Skills Act, there's a significant merging of responsibility, both in terms of delivering skills, bringing together further education and higher education, and indeed under the access requirements, putting the responsibility on universities to increase the standards of compulsory education. All of that seems inappropriate for a vibrant and world ranking higher education system. And indeed, that seems to be somewhat problematic given little recognition of how other countries have grown in their representations in the world rankings for higher education. Here, I am explicitly thinking of China and Asia. All of this leads us into a difficult decision. We need to understand why the Minister for Higher and Further Education argues that her kudo for her work is to go for quality, transparency, and fairness. These seem to be in short supply in the recommendations that this government is making for higher education. Now, I know I'm rather negative on how things are developing in higher education, but we must really take time to consider not what is said, but why the information is presented in the way it is, and what hides behind this, this process that the government embarks upon. It does seem to me that the idea is to step back to the 70s, where we had a small level of high-ranking universities who provided for the rich, and the small number of students who managed to reach the universities and then benefit from, indeed benefit greatly from the benefits that qualifications that they gained offered them in the employment sector. We have to concern ourselves deeply about what is happening with regard to education, flourishing, civic duty, moral leadership within the whole rubric of these new regulations and suggestions by the minister. this is serious. Middlesex is not ranking amongst the institutions that the government is looking to preserve, but looking at those institutions that it might well attack. Have a good week. Take care.